Most people think they are tired because they have done too much. But if you look closely at your day, you will notice something uncomfortable. You are not physically exhausted, you are cognitively overloaded. You sit at a desk, scroll on your phone, answer a few emails, maybe attend a meeting, maybe run errands, and yet by the end of the day your brain feels like it has been squeezed dry. You call it laziness, you call it lack of motivation, you blame your discipline, but the real problem is invisible. It is mental load. It is the constant demand placed on your cognitive system to decide, evaluate, remember, switch, suppress, compare, anticipate, and keep track of dozens of unfinished loops at the same time. Mental exhaustion is rarely about how much you did, it is about how much your brain had to hold. Every decision you make, no matter how small, costs energy. What to wear, what to eat, which message to reply to first, whether to ignore that notification, whether you should start working now or wait 10 more minutes, whether that tone in someone's text meant something negative, whether you're behind compared to others, whether you're doing enough with your life. Each one seems trivial, but together they form a constant stream of micro choices. This is decision fatigue. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning, reasoning, and self control, does not have unlimited fuel. The more decisions it makes, the less efficient it becomes. That is why by evening you are more impulsive, more avoidant, more likely to procrastinate, and more likely to default to easy dopamine like scrolling or snacking. It is not weakness, it is depletion. When your cognitive resources are drained, your brain shifts into energy conservation mode. It seeks low effort, high reward behaviors. The tragedy is that modern life multiplies decisions beyond what our biology evolved to handle. Hundreds of daily choices that did not exist a century ago now demand attention. Which app to check, which news to believe, which productivity system to follow, which path to take in your career, which identity to present online. Even the illusion of choice is draining. Standing in front of endless options requires evaluation, and evaluation requires energy. Now add cognitive overload on top of that. Cognitive overload happens when the amount of information you are processing exceeds your working memory capacity. Working memory is limited. It can hold only a few chunks of information at once. Yet you constantly ask it to juggle emails, deadlines, personal worries, long-term goals, social comparisons, and background anxieties. Imagine trying to run multiple heavy programs on an old computer with limited RAM. The system slows down. It freezes. It overheats. That is your brain when you say, I just can't think anymore. You are not incapable. You are overloaded. Multitasking makes it worse. What you call multitasking is actually rapid task switching. Each switch has a cognitive cost. Your brain must disengage from one task, reorient to another, retrieve the relevant context, and suppress interference from the previous task. These micro switches accumulate into mental friction. By the end of the day, you feel scattered because your attention has been fragmented into dozens of tiny pieces. You never entered deep focus. You never completed the cognitive cycle of a meaningful task. You stayed in shallow mode, reacting rather than progressing. And then there are open loops. Open loops are unfinished tasks, unresolved decisions, unspoken conversations, and vague intentions that your brain has flagged as incomplete. When something is unfinished, your brain keeps it active in the background. It is a survival mechanism. Incomplete tasks signal potential risk, so your mind reminds you, not loudly, but persistently, that email you have not replied to, that project you started but did not finish, that difficult conversation you are avoiding, that goal you keep postponing. Each one occupies mental bandwidth. You may not consciously think about them every minute, but they consume cognitive space. It is like having dozens of browser tabs open in the background. Even if you are not looking at them, they slow the system. This is why you can feel tired even on a light day. It is not about visible effort. It is about invisible load. The more unclosed loops you carry, the heavier your mental state becomes. The worst part is that mental clutter does not feel dramatic. It feels normal. It feels like constant low-grade noise, a subtle tension in your chest, a background restlessness, a sense that you should be doing something else, that you are behind, that you forgot something. This constant cognitive hum drains more energy than a single intense effort. Deep work is tiring but satisfying. Mental clutter is tiring and unsatisfying. It gives you exhaustion without accomplishment. That is why you end the day feeling drained but unsure what you actually did. Your brain spent energy managing, switching, suppressing, anticipating, and worrying rather than executing in a focused way. Social comparison amplifies this overload. Every time you scroll through curated achievements and optimized lifestyles, your brain evaluates your position. Am I ahead? Behind? Should I pivot? Should I improve? Should I learn that skill? That evaluation process is cognitively expensive. It triggers self-referential thinking, future simulation, and identity comparison. You think you are just scrolling, but cognitively you are analyzing, judging, and recalibrating your sense of self. That costs energy. Add constant notifications to the equation. Each notification is not just a sound, it is a demand. It says, decide now. Even if you ignore it, your brain must evaluate whether to respond. That micro-evaluation depletes resources. Over time, your attention becomes trained to expect interruption. Sustained focus becomes harder because your cognitive system has adapted to constant novelty. Novelty triggers dopamine. Deep focus requires delaying dopamine. When you are mentally tired, delaying reward feels almost impossible. So you choose quick stimulation instead of meaningful progress. And then you blame yourself. You call it procrastination. But procrastination is often not about laziness. It is about avoidance of cognitive strain. Starting a demanding task requires upfront mental investment. When your cognitive battery is low, your brain resists at cost. It seeks something easier, something familiar, something that does not require heavy working memory. This is why rest does not always fix mental exhaustion. You can sleep 8 hours and still feel drained, because the issue is not only physical fatigue, it is accumulated cognitive load. If your mind wakes up to the same unresolved loops, the same clutter, the same overwhelming number of decisions, it immediately reactivates the stress circuits. You are tired before you even start. So what is actually happening under the surface is that your executive control system is overused. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for regulation and planning, gets fatigued. When it is fatigued, emotional reactivity increases. You become more irritable, less patient, more sensitive to minor stressors. It feels like you are on edge. That edge is simply reduced cognitive margin. You have no buffer left. Small demands feel big because there is no spare capacity. This is why simplifying decisions can dramatically improve mental clarity. When you reduce trivial choices, you preserve energy for meaningful ones. That is why routines are powerful. They automate low-level decisions. When something becomes habitual, it shifts from effortful processing to automatic processing, which consumes far less cognitive fuel. Structure is not restriction, it is protection. It protects your mental bandwidth from unnecessary leakage. Another key factor is emotional suppression. When you experience emotion but push it away instead of processing it, you create internal friction. Suppression requires continuous monitoring. Your brain must keep the emotion contained. That monitoring costs energy. Over time, suppressed emotions become additional open loops. Unprocessed experiences linger in the background, subtly influencing attention and mood. Emotional regulation through acknowledgement is less draining than suppression. Naming what you feel reduces cognitive load because it integrates the experience instead of fighting it. But most people are not taught this. They are taught to push through, so they accumulate invisible weight. If you feel mentally tired all the time, it is not because you are broken. It is because your environment is cognitively dense. Information is abundant. Expectations are high. Boundaries are blurred. Work follows you home through your phone. Social comparison never turns off. Your brain evolved for simpler contexts. Now it is forced to operate at high intensity continuously. And continuous high intensity cognition without structured recovery leads to chronic mental fatigue. The solution is not to shame yourself into working harder. It is to reduce load, not just time load, but cognitive load. Ask yourself how many decisions you are making daily that could be automated. How many unfinished tasks you are carrying without a system to capture and close them. How often you are switching tasks instead of completing one. How much information you consume that does not serve a specific purpose. Each of these is a leak. When you plug enough leaks, energy returns. Clarity returns. Motivation returns. Because motivation often emerges when cognitive friction decreases. When a task feels manageable in your mental field, you approach it. When it feels heavy and ambiguous, you avoid it. Mental exhaustion is often the accumulation of ambiguity. Undefined goals, unclear next steps, vague responsibilities. Your brain hates vagueness because vagueness requires constant background computation. Clarity reduces load. A clear next action requires less processing than a broad abstract intention. Work on project is heavy. Write the first paragraph is lighter. Specificity shrinks cognitive demand. You are not tired because you lack ambition. You are tired because your mental operating system is overloaded with too many open processes. When you understand this, you stop attacking your character and start adjusting your structure. You realize that energy management is not just about sleep and diet. It is about decision design, attention control, loop closure, and information boundaries. In the next part, we will go deeper into how decision fatigue subtly shapes your behavior, how open loops silently drain your cognitive resources, and how to systematically clear mental clutter so your brain can operate with more precision and less strain. If you look closely at your most unproductive days, you will notice a pattern that has nothing to do with laziness and everything to do with depletion. You wake up with decent intentions, maybe even a clear priority, but within a few hours your mind feels foggy, your focus becomes fragile, and even small tasks feel disproportionately heavy. This is decision fatigue unfolding in real time. Decision fatigue is not dramatic. It does not announce itself loudly. It shows up as subtle hesitation, as increased scrolling, as I'll do it later, as choosing the easiest available option instead of the most meaningful one. Every decision you make throughout the day slightly reduces your cognitive control. At first, the effect is negligible. Choosing breakfast, responding to a message, selecting what to wear, deciding whether to check notifications. But these micro decisions accumulate. Your prefrontal cortex, which governs planning, inhibition, and goal-directed behavior, operates like a limited resource system. It is not infinite. As the day progresses, especially if you have been making continuous choices without structure, its efficiency declines. That decline changes your behavior. You become more reactive. You default to habits rather than deliberate action. You avoid tasks that require sustained mental effort. And because modern life forces you to choose constantly, the depletion begins earlier than you expect. Consider how many invisible decisions you make in a typical hour. Should I reply now or later? Should I open that link? Should I say yes to this request? Should I prioritize this over that? Even deciding not to decide consumes mental energy because your brain must evaluate and suppress. This is why structured routines feel liberating rather than restrictive. When you remove trivial decisions, you conserve cognitive energy for meaningful ones. High performers often reduce variability in small areas of life not because they lack creativity, but because they understand cognitive conservation. If breakfast is automatic, if your morning routine is fixed, if your work blocks are predetermined, you free up mental bandwidth. The less you negotiate with yourself about low-stakes choices, the more capacity you retain for complex thinking. Now layer cognitive overload onto this. Cognitive overload happens when your working memory is saturated. Working memory is the mental space where you temporarily hold and manipulate information. It is limited. You cannot hold 10 complex ideas simultaneously with equal clarity, yet your daily environment demands that you try. Emails reference previous threads. Projects require integrating multiple data points. Conversations overlap. Notifications interrupt your thought stream. Every interruption forces your brain to reload context. Context switching is expensive. When you switch tasks, your brain does not instantly reset. Residual attention remains attached to the previous task. This residue creates friction. Over time, friction becomes fatigue. You feel mentally scattered because your attention has been divided into fragments. None of the fragments are large enough to complete something meaningful, but together they exhaust you. This is why shallow work feels so draining. You may have spent the whole day busy, yet you completed nothing significant. Your brain was constantly engaged but never deeply immersed. Deep work, while demanding, is cognitively coherent. It channels attention into one direction. Shallow multitasking disperses attention across many directions. Dispersion increases cognitive strain because your brain must repeatedly reorient. Imagine lifting a heavy weight continuously for 30 minutes. That is intense but straightforward. Now imagine lifting a lighter weight hundreds of times in erratic bursts without rhythm. The second scenario often feels more irritating and draining. That is how fragmented attention works. Then there are open loops, perhaps the most underestimated source of mental exhaustion. An open loop is any commitment, task, or unresolved issue that your brain perceives as incomplete. It does not have to be urgent to consume energy. It only needs to be unfinished. When you promise yourself you will start exercising but do not define when, that becomes an open loop. When you delay responding to a message because it feels uncomfortable, that becomes an open loop. When you begin a project without clarifying the next action, that too remains open. The brain is wired to seek closure. Incomplete tasks create cognitive tension. Psychologically, unfinished business lingers in memory more persistently than completed tasks. This persistence means your brain periodically resurfaces reminders. Even if they are faint, they require processing. Multiply this by dozens of small commitments and you create a background hum of mental pressure. It is not loud enough to demand full attention, but it is constant enough to drain energy. Think of your mind as a workspace. Every open loop is an item left on the desk. One item is manageable. 50 items create clutter. Clutter forces your brain to continually scan and reprioritize. That scanning costs energy. This is why writing things down reduces stress. Externalizing commitments moves them from working memory to a trusted system. When your brain trusts that something is captured, it relaxes. The loop is not fully closed, but it is contained. Containment reduces cognitive load. Without containment, your brain keeps reminding you because it fears forgetting. Many people underestimate how much energy is spent on not forgetting. Remembering birthdays, deadlines, follow-ups, goals, conversations. If you rely solely on mental storage, your cognitive system remains in alert mode. Alert mode is exhausting. Creating a simple capture system, even a basic notebook, dramatically reduces internal noise. You are not trying to remember everything. You are trying to remember where you stored it. That shift alone decreases load. Now consider emotional open loops. These are unresolved feelings that you have not processed or expressed. Perhaps resentment toward a colleague, guilt about procrastination, anxiety about future uncertainty. When you suppress emotion, your brain allocates resources to monitoring it. Suppression is not free. It requires active inhibition. That inhibition uses the same executive resources you need for focus and discipline. Over time, emotional suppression compounds decision fatigue. You are not only managing tasks, you are managing feelings about tasks. That double management accelerates exhaustion. This is why labeling emotions reduces mental strain. When you identify what you are feeling, you integrate it into conscious awareness. Integration consumes less energy than suppression. The phrase name it to tame it captures a neurological truth. Clarity reduces load. Vague discomfort drains more energy than clearly identified emotion because vagueness keeps your brain searching. The search process itself is tiring. Another silent contributor to mental exhaustion is anticipatory simulation. Your brain constantly simulates possible futures. What if this fails? What if I am behind? What if I disappoint someone? Simulation helps planning, but excessive simulation overloads working memory, especially when combined with uncertainty. Your mind cycles through scenarios without resolution. Each scenario occupies mental space. If you do not convert simulation into a defined plan, it remains an open cognitive thread. Many people mistake this constant mental rehearsal for productivity. They believe thinking equals progress. But repetitive, unstructured thinking without action is mental spinning. It consumes energy without producing closure. The more you ruminate, the less energy you have for execution. Social media intensifies this dynamic. Exposure to curated success stories triggers comparative simulation. Your brain recalculates your trajectory. Should I change direction? Should I learn that skill? Should I be further along? Each comparison generates micro decisions and future scenarios. You may spend only minutes scrolling, but cognitively you have engaged in dozens of evaluations. That evaluation load accumulates. Over time, your baseline cognitive state becomes saturated. Saturation reduces tolerance for additional effort. That is why even starting a simple task feels overwhelming. It is not the task itself. It is the total load you are already carrying. So how do you reduce mental clutter systematically rather than temporarily? First, reduce unnecessary decisions. Pre-decide recurring elements of your life. Choose fixed times for certain activities. Simplify options. Limit exposure to trivial choices. The goal is not rigidity. It is energy preservation. Second, minimize task switching. Batch similar activities. Allocate defined blocks for communication instead of constant checking. Every time you resist an unnecessary switch, you protect cognitive continuity. Third, externalize open loops. Write down everything that is unfinished, not to judge yourself, but to see the true inventory. Clarity reduces anxiety because the unknown becomes known. Once listed, define the next physical action for each meaningful item. If the next step is ambiguous, your brain keeps it active. If it is concrete, it feels lighter. Fourth, close small loops quickly. Minor unresolved tasks often create disproportionate cognitive weight. If something takes 2 minutes, finish it. Completion releases tension. Fifth, create intentional shutdown rituals. At the end of the day, review what is pending and decide when it will be addressed. This signals to your brain that it is safe to disengage. Without this ritual, your mind continues rehearsing unfinished work at night. Sleep quality declines. Fatigue compounds. Finally, guard your input. Information is not neutral. Every piece of content you consume becomes a potential cognitive threat. Be selective. Ask whether what you are consuming requires action or reflection. If not, you are adding noise. Noise increases load. Mental clarity is not achieved by pushing harder. It is achieved by subtracting friction. When cognitive demand decreases, energy rises naturally. You stop fighting yourself. You stop labeling your fatigue as personal failure. You recognize it as systemic overload. And once you see it clearly, you can redesign your environment instead of criticizing your character. In the next part, we will move from understanding to integration, exploring how to build a sustainable mental architecture that protects your cognitive resources long term, how to design recovery that actually restores executive function, and how to maintain clarity in a world that constantly tries to fragment your attention. By now, it should be clear that your exhaustion is not a character flaw but a structural consequence of how your cognitive system is being used. The final step is integration. Understanding decision fatigue, cognitive overload, and open loops is useful, but insight without redesign changes nothing. If you return to the same fragmented structure tomorrow, the same fatigue will return with it. Sustainable mental clarity requires architecture. It requires designing your environment, your workflow, and your internal habits in a way that protects executive function instead of draining it. The first principle of sustainable mental energy is deliberate constraint. Modern culture equates freedom with unlimited options, but unlimited options create cognitive strain. Constraint reduces friction. When you define clear working hours, you reduce daily negotiation. When you define what done means for a task, you reduce ambiguity. When you define your priorities for the week before the week begins, you prevent constant reevaluation. Reevaluation is expensive. Pre-commitment is protective. Every time you pre-decide something meaningful, you remove dozens of micro-decisions later. The second principle is depth over dispersion. You cannot eliminate effort, but you can concentrate it. Deep, uninterrupted work feels intense, yet paradoxically it leaves you less drained than shallow fragmentation. When you immerse yourself in a single cognitively demanding task, your brain operates coherently. Neural networks synchronize around one objective. This coherence reduces switching costs. After a deep session, you feel tired but satisfied. Fragmented sessions create a different type of fatigue, restless, unfulfilled, mentally noisy. To build depth, you must create boundaries around the tension. That means define focus blocks where notifications are silenced, tabs are minimized, and one outcome is pursued. It also means accepting that not everything deserves immediate response. Urgency is often manufactured. Protecting depth is protecting energy. The third principle is systematic closure. Open loops are not resolved by thinking about them repeatedly. They are resolved by either completing them, scheduling them, or consciously deleting them. Completion is obvious. Scheduling creates containment. Deleting requires courage. Many mental loops persist because you refuse to decide. You keep vague intentions alive because letting go feels like failure. But ambiguity drains more energy than honest elimination. When you consciously decide that something is no longer a priority, you free cognitive space. That space is not trivial. It becomes available for what truly matters. A practical integration method is the weekly cognitive reset. Once a week, empty everything from your mind onto paper or a digital system. Tasks, worries, ideas, obligations, unresolved conversations. Do not filter. Externalize. Then categorize. Which require action? Which require planning? Which are emotional rather than practical? Which can be discarded? This ritual prevents accumulation. Without periodic reset, mental clutter slowly rebuilds. You may not notice it day to day, but over weeks it becomes heavy. The fourth principle is emotional processing rather than suppression. Mental architecture is not only about tasks, it is about feelings. If you consistently override frustration, resentment, anxiety, or disappointment without reflection, those emotions remain active beneath awareness. They consume regulatory resources. Emotional literacy reduces load. When something triggers you, pause and label it, not dramatically. Simply identify it. Frustration, insecurity. There, then ask what boundary or adjustment is required. Sometimes the adjustment is external. Sometimes it is internal. But naming the emotion prevents it from becoming a silent background process. The fifth principle is intentional recovery. Many people attempt to recover by consuming more stimulation. They scroll, binge, multitask entertainment. But recovery of executive function requires reduction of input, not replacement. True cognitive recovery occurs when your brain is not forced to evaluate or decide. Walking without headphones, sitting without scrolling, light physical movement, even boredom. Boredom allows neural systems to recalibrate. If every break contains high stimulation, your brain never exits processing mode. You feel entertained but not restored. The sixth principle is energy alignment. Not all hours are equal. Your cognitive peak likely occurs at a predictable time each day. Identify it. Protect it for your most demanding work. Place shallow tasks in lower energy periods. When you align task difficulty with biological rhythm, you reduce unnecessary strain. Many people exhaust themselves by attempting high-level thinking during low-energy windows, then blaming themselves for underperformance. Structure should work with your nervous system, not against it. The seventh principle is identity shift. Stop defining yourself as someone who lacks discipline or motivation. Those labels increase cognitive pressure. When you view yourself as overloaded rather than incapable, your approach changes. You look for subtraction instead of self-criticism. Self-criticism itself consumes energy. It activates stress responses and internal conflict. Compassion is not softness. It is efficiency. When you remove internal attack, you conserve resources. The eighth principle is digital boundary design. Your devices are engineered to fragment attention. If you do not intentionally configure them, they will configure you. Disable non-essential notifications. Remove apps that trigger compulsive checking. Create friction for distraction rather than for focus. Even small adjustments like moving distracting apps off the home screen reduce impulse frequency. Less impulse means fewer micro-decisions. Fewer micro-decisions mean less fatigue. The ninth principle is clarity before action. Before starting a task, define the next physical step, not the abstract goal, the physical action. Open the document. Write the outline. Call the client. Specificity lowers initiation cost. When initiation cost is low, resistance decreases. Resistance often signals ambiguity, not inability. Reduce ambiguity and energy returns. The 10th principle is conscious stopping. Many people never truly end their workday. They drift out of it. Drifting leaves loops open. Instead, create a deliberate shutdown sequence. Review what you completed. List what remains. Decide when it will be addressed. Then stop. This communicates safety to your cognitive system. It reduces nighttime rumination. Over time, sleep improves. Better sleep restores executive function. Restored executive function improves clarity. Clarity reduces overload. This becomes a positive cycle. Understand that mental energy is not about constant productivity. It is about sustainable clarity. There will be demanding days. There will be intense seasons. But intensity without structure leads to chronic depletion. Structure without flexibility leads to rigidity. The balance lies in intentional design. When you reduce unnecessary decisions, batch similar tasks, externalize commitments, process emotions, align with biological rhythm, and protect attention, something shifts. You stop feeling perpetually behind. You stop mistaking overload for laziness. You begin to notice that when your cognitive field is clear, motivation feels natural, focus feels easier, starting feels lighter. This is not magic. It is reduced friction. The hidden cause of mental exhaustion is not weakness. It is accumulated cognitive strain from unmanaged inputs, unresolved loops, and endless micro-decisions. When you redesign your system, you reclaim energy that was never lost, only scattered. You realize that you were never lazy. You were mentally overloaded. And overload is not solved by pushing harder. It is solved by caring less.